Hello, my name is Brant Hunt, that is. My channel is simply called Discerning What is True, and today is the 23rd day of April 2024. I'm going to be reading the book by Alvin Boyd Kuhn, K-U-H-N, that is last name. The book is called The Red Sea is Your Blood, Part 2. So thank you for being here. And so we'll start where we ended last night and continue on. When the Palestinian religious reformulated their body of their religious concepts, which they drew from ancient Egypt, they switched the alphabetical sign of water from the letter N over to the letter M, and just about all words significant water-matter begins with M ever since. The reason for this transfer the present writer has not discovered anywhere in his research, but there is no gainsaying the fact of it. Our own written English M still represents 3 of these original 7 waves of water, printed from only 2. And our written and printed N still represents 2 waves, while the Hebrew word for water in the sense of the sea is I-A-M. The Hebrew word for water as such is Mayim, spelled M-A-Y-I-M, which I think has to do with Mary, which being a plural ending in I-M would really be waters or waves. And how vividly instructive this pursuit of meaning in the construction of words can become is well illustrated here when we consider the Hebrew word for, quote, heaven, end quote. The first chapter of Genesis speaks of the general concept of heaven in the phrase translated, that is, quote, the waters of the firmament, end quote. But the firmament, that is, the underlying indestructible first essence of all creation, was always represented as dual, divided into the firmament above and the firmament below. The Egyptian savants have divided the creation to upper Nun, N-U-N, and the lower Nun. This would refer to the division of the primordial, undifferential, homogeneous matter. The Nun, N-U-N, into the masculine spiritual is Yun, N-U, and the feminine material is Nut, N-U-T. In life, universal polarities in the periods of manifestation when it when it is not dormant in the phase of unmanifestation, called by the Hindus pralalya. This would give precisely what Genesis does give in its very first verse. In the beginning, God created the heavens, that is the upper Nun, and the earth, that is the lower Nun, end quote. Now, all things pertaining to the material or lower Nun side of life, eternal duality, were symbolized by the 2, quote, lower, end quote, elements, earth and water. Likewise, all things pertaining to the upper Nun side were symbolized by the 2, quote, higher elements, end quote, that is, air and fire. How clearly nature both sanctions and typifies this and seen in the fact that on the earth below we have earth and water, while above we have air and the sun's fire. So this is also key in the 4 elements. The 2 are based what we call earth and water to tend to be what I call earth based, and the air and fire signs tend to be what we call uppercase, so to speak. Also, we have fire in the upper air in the form of lightning in a thunderstorm. The next section is called Fire on Heaven's Heart. That's spelled H-E-A-R-T-H. Water, however, is not confined solely to earth, but in the forms of vapor that is visible as clouds. You see, the clouds themselves have vapor in them, which is water. Or rain, and is visible as rarefied water vapor, prevails the earth's upper regions. But here we have in the Hebrew concept of the heavens, the idea of heaven as the place where the waters of the upper firmament are associated with fire, that is, sun or lightning. Hence, to the word for water, mayim, again referring to Mary, they prefix that great letter of their alphabet, which is the symbol for fire, the letter Shin, S-H-I-N. And this gives the word for, quote, heaven, as, quote, Shemayim. This would convey all the range of meanings which flows from the idea of the original fiery power of the divine mind or spirit of God, interfusing itself in the essence of water-matter to beget the universe. The waters of the lower firmaments would be Mayim. Those of the upper firmament would be Shemayim. How astonishing these basic concepts find both illustrations and corroboration in nature is seen when we reflect that the sound of the dynamics letter SH, meaning that is fire, is actually produced when one introduces fire into water. The hissing, the sissing sound. Actually, in the natural graph, we have in a vivid picturization the basic idea involved in the creation itself. That is the projection from God of the fiery power of his creative energies and their being injected into the innermost core or womb of matter. Remember, matter pertains to female. This is what is meant by the statements found in Hindu religious literature that the birth of creation took place or began with the shooting of the cosmic ray Purusha, eternal spirit, into the womb of Prakriti, or matter, the eternal universal mother. That's why you hear the analogies many times when the earth is considered mother. When, with a explosion bang that the human mind will never forget, modern science has demonstrated the fact of staggering significance that all matter is, one might say, on fire with energy and trembling with a wondering anticipation of the next, even more staggering discovery that will forever rock the human mind and end forever the age-old controversy between materialism and idealism over the question whether the primordial energy that created the universe is merely a physical force or the power of thinking mind. The intellect of man approaches closer and closer to the recognition that the ultimate and original force that generated life and being must be mind. Science has now resolved matter back into pure force, into energy. Matter is energy that has somehow cooled down, and like anything gaseous or fluid that cools down, it has gelled, end quote, become static, grown hard. It has crystallized and settled into concrete state. And having demonstrated this suspendous fact, now the spectacle prying mind of man awakes in trembling suspense the confirmation of the next world-shaking idea. That energy is itself the potentiality of thinking mind. Phenomenon of modern life that has forced itself on our attention in the midst of the endless panorama of scientific discovery and achievement is the surprise recognition that much of the substance of our latest attainment and knowledge seem to have been in the possession of certain of the ancient peoples, more particular the Egyptians, from whom it is evident that the Sagacious Greeks derived the principle of the philosophical systematism which they developed to such grandiose heights in the Periclean period, some 4 centuries BC. Hardly less brilliant was the rekindling of that light of the Platonic age, which flared up after the dimming of the great flame following the fall of Athens, in the movement of what is known as Neoplatonism, about the 2nd century AD, when Amorius Saccas established a school of, quote, of esoteric wisdom, end quote. So his name is Ammonius, Ammonias, and his last name is Saccas. He established the school of esoteric wisdom. This effort produced Numinus and Maximus of Tyre, Tyre, after whom came four giants of the philosophical world, that is, Polonius, Porphyria, and Amblicius. I don't know why I said four. Oh, okay, the ones, okay, all right. Running like a thread of fire all through the master works of this group, to which a little later Plutarch may be added, is the idea that the primary prototype, or first essence of which the creation is composed, the, quote, stuff of which all things are made, is, as modern thought suspects may be the very miracle of truth, is in very fact, mind, M-I-N-D. Yet affirm these profound thinkers, not only is matter crystallized force, energy, that energy in turn is fluid mind, buried for these many centuries in the forgotten books of these great philosophers to be specified in a magnificent work entitled the Sixth Book of Proclus on the Theology of Plato. There has stood a sentence which had it begin, brought out, and kept in recognition, might well have saved Europe 1,500 years of the Dark Ages and brought modern science that much sooner. That is, to quote, the light of the sun is the pure energy of intellect, end quote. No one can fail to see the redoubting challenges of this pronouncement out of the wisdom of the long past. It makes pertinent the question whether, with all the present incredible scientific marvels, we have yet caught up with the accruement of ancient Egypt and Greece. It seems as though since those ages of the Egyptians and the Greece, there seems to be what I would call a slow, stagnant type of movement, a piece at a time, so to speak. It takes longer to get there. Basically, the Western mind is still plodding very slowly. For there is evidence that those sapient Egyptian priests, as likewise the Chaldean astrologers, had at least a theoretical knowledge of the nature and constitution of the atom, though so far as we would judge, no cyclotrons to demonstrate the physical actuality. The profundity of Platonic and then the Neoplatonic philosophy is a undimmed marvel in universities where they are still studied. If these, and perhaps even Hindu thinkers, had knowledge that the fiery force of mind flamed on the hearthstone of every atom, they were theoretically in advance of where we stand today. We have made the discovery that the thinking process in the human brain generates both heat and light, or electric energy. Experiments conducted by attaching to the heads of students a sensitive electrical device registered the generation of small quantities of force sufficient to light up a small electric bulb and run a tiny motor. The scriptures have analogized the mental creation of the universe in the biblical phrase, quote, God spake, and the world sprang into existence, end quote. But back of all speech is thought. So it might be said that, quote, what God had wrought is what God had first thought, end quote. If the evidence for this connection of creative energy with creative mind is conclusive, we have a final and welcome, that is, settlement of the eternal squabble over the question of the nature and constituency of the universe, and the laurel wreath goes to idealism. The universe is the expression of the supreme divine intellect. Its majesty ideas have become concrete in what we have called matter. By an omnipresent instinct of reflecting intelligence, men have universally thought of one tangible thing in the realm of life as the appropriate symbol of all mental intelligence in the human area of consciousness, the thing we call light. And we have found Proclus asserting that the light of suns, S-U-N-S, is the pure radiance of intellect. What a concept this gives us as we gaze into the, quote, heavens, end quote, of a clear, dark night, and see the infinite hosts of those suns twinkling through the dark of space. For it, Proclus is right, those infinite points of light are the scintillating brain cells of the mind of God. It is declared that a normal human being has 4 quadrillion brain cells. That's right, 4 quadrillion brain cells. We can generously allow God a few quintillions at least. We can see some billions, even if we can not count them. We have now proof that brain cells are very, very tiny on our scale to our relative proportions, units of the same energy that glows, seeth in the flames of thousands of miles dimensions on the surface of the sun. Yet we know that in proportion to their size, they are as far apart from each other as the suns in the spread of space. Here's a perfect analogy. And if the scriptures do not speak other nonsense when they declare that man is made in the image of God, they mean that our brain cells match his, and his matches ours in function and in kind. So there's not really many excuses, is there? God didn't give me a brain. Well, the problem is simply because you haven't sought knowledge, and that will give you wisdom, and eventually will lead to truth, you see. Man is declared in the secret wisdom of the ancient sages to be the microcosm, but still a full duplicate of the macrocosm. And Hermes of Egypt, probably the sages of Earth's great sages, called by the Greeks thrice greatest, end quote, put this basic principle understanding clearly before us in his ever memorable statement, quote, true without falsehood, certain and most true. That which is above is as that which is below, and that which is below is as that which is above, for the performance of the miracle of the one thing, end quote. And the Sophists, that is, of Athens, said, quote, man is the measure of all things, end quote. He has to be, for if he is the universe in miniature, he has to gauge all things by himself. Hence the Greeks adjured us, quote, man, know thyself, and thou wilt know all things, end quote. Hence, also the ancient seers warned man of the folly and the dangers of worshiping any supposedly divine power outside their own being and nature, since all the power of the creation was already impounded in the confines of a human life, needing only development to bring it to the, quote, the fullness of the Godhead or Godhood bodily. Continue. Order below and fire above is in the cosmos, in man, is the manifest order of things. As for man, the below is his body, composed 7/8 of water. The above is the fiery energy of thinking mind and is a quadrillion of brain cells. In the phase of the poet, in the being of man, quote, heaven and earth have kissed each other, end quote. More than that, under the stress of polarity, they have entered into mutual relationship which they are destined to woo, win, and wed each other, and in generation after generation give birth in their wedlock to new stages of the creation. In a mass of legendary fable concocted in the somatic geniuses of these sages of olden times was the tradition that when Messiah appeared, he would come up out of the sea. Truly enough, now with our eyes conditioned to a sort of new infrared power to pierce the darkness in which the archaic cryptic figurism has been enshrouded, we can see how clearly this form of legendary tells the truth. For of course, since the, quote, life of the soul, end quote, as the scripture tells us, quote, it is in the blood, end quote. I can remember even a song, folks, there's life in the blood. The divine power that will rise to deify us must come up out of the seawater, endowed with electric potency that is found to reside in the ocean waters. It should be realized that the blood is electrically charged. It is itself dynamic with a measure of the magic of the suns. Were it not so, the mere physical forces of the heart pumping could not drive it out through the firing channels of the veins and draw it all back again. In other words, it wouldn't work if it wasn't electrically charged in some way. All cells of the body share the life that emanates the whole. And it is certain that the venous and arterial channel walls furnish some pumping power, some constriction and expansion in rhythm to push the blood along in aid of the heart. If viewed from the purely mechanical or purely materialistic standpoint, man is just a machine. That's what most people have made a mistake of. The mistake of materialistic thought is in supposing that he is just a machine. He is a machine that is alive and is in every cell, to its degree, a thinking machine. We will approximate a truer view of man if we think of him as we might of a great printing press, every part of which, not dead, but consciously alive, keeps feeling, thinking, and voluntarily exerting itself to perform its functions in the economy of the whole operation of printing. Had the world held on to this living conception of man, which inherited from the occult legacy of a golden age in early human history, when it is a legend, the gods still mingle with Earth's inhabitants. A rosier cinematograph, would have been the panorama of the last 2,000 years of the world's dark record. The mechanism, that is, the dead mechanicalism concept of man's nature, has been the index of the world's most, particularly the Western world, that is, the gradation of man's own concept of himself. And where did that come from? You see. As far as it can go, this concept takes no account on the spontaneous and unconquerable instincts and feelings welling up within the human consciousness, a hard, cold posture of mind which tends to chill, to freeze, and deaden the dynamic, free-acting forces generally innate in the human constitution. The influence of the conscious mind upon the operation of the unconscious process of the body, such as breathing, digestion, assimilation, heartbeat, is not accurately known, but it must be unquestionably great. Therefore, the thought that one body is a machine of purely non-living parts which work by purely physical and not by biophysical laws and chemistries is itself a force that will tend to slow and deaden the body living actions. Having potently, a philosophy that pours into the body the power of mental conceptions of its free-flowing, self-initiating mind energies would affect well-being for the human organism, has been well attested by the more or less, quote, miraculous, end quote, cures and healings registered by the upsurge of faith, confidence, hope, and other positive attitudes of mind. Perhaps the most efficacious conception that the human individual can hold with regard to his own life and well-being is the idea that he is a dynamo of vibrant, intelligent energy, a quantum of the conscious thinking power that has generated and eternally activates the creation. If his thought lacks this element of the efficiency of spirit, he hardens his life and tightens around himself the prison walls that confine the free forces of his soul within the habitations they have built for their expression in the incarnation process. They are turned into a rigid, cumbersome incubus on the soul instead of a being the placid, adaptable instrument for the soul-free expression. As Browning puts it, quote, walk, wall upon wall, the Goth's flesh hems it in, end quote. And another poet has spoken of the soul as, quote, crypt, cabinet, and confined, end quote, in the body. In fact, this aspect of the soul life received such emphasis in the great Greek philosophy that always the body was dramatized as not only the prison house of the soul, but even its grave and tomb. That's correct. Since when the soul descends into body, its subjection to the slow, sluggish tempo of the fleshly vehicle threw it into a torpor, a coma, a kind of actual, quote, death, end quote, from which it had in the final outcome of the evolution of his resurrection. Of his evolution to be resurrected. The Greeks, in fact, used practically the same word for body as for tomb, the former being somo, S-O-M-A, and the latter, semo, S-E-M-A. One can see the aptness of this symbolism when resort is again had to be typology of water for the body element and fire for the soul force. For naturally, water extinguishes fire, kills it, you see. St. Paul in Romans chapter 7 says that the incarnation of his soul in body killed him. But he added, he will regain his life, have his resurrection through the power of the Lord Jesus Christ, which will overcome, quote, the body of this death, end quote, and grant him life eternal. Ancient wise men, those, that is, Egyptian priests, always thought of soul entering body for its life work under the figure of fire plunging into water, or soul crossing the, quote, Red Sea, end quote, meaning by the sea the body's blood. Such conceptions and figures held thought in fluidity and tended to keep the body placid so as to be responsive to the impact of the thought power of the central brain intelligence upon the nerve life of all the cells of the body. Whatever possibility man has of living a radiant life inherited in this sort of a mental attitude, which a materialist philosopher chills to innate. One will find a strange face of momentous significance in this connection right in the dictionary. It is that the great body of verbs indicating the initiation of movement begins with the letter S, or the equivalent of being SH. These are the letters which start, shove off all kinds of movement, such as strike, slap, stamp, smit, speak, slide, streak, skate, send, shoot, spear, slip, slump, spit, strive, step, sneak, steal, scrap, scream, sing, and scores more. That this is no happy fantasy of ours, and confirmed by the definite fact that the ancient Egyptian language prefix S or SH to words denoting a state or condition to make them mean the act of producing that state or condition. One example is mat, M-A-A-T, true, from the stem mak, M-A, true, which when S is prefix becomes S-M-A, meaning to confirm, establish, i.e. to, quote, make true, end quote. This must have come from the fact of the introduction of soul into the body, that is the water, in its incarnation, producing the S or SH sound. Started all things off, set all things going for the life of the soul, that is the letter sound, suggests the initiative step in life. The extent to which the ancient Sadducees resorted to poetic tropism of this kind would not be believed generally. So you see, it simply is that I think the illustration maybe I shared last night, maybe I didn't, is that we come from water in our mother's body. And when her water breaks, that means simply is this the time for the child to enter the world. You see. So not only the water's out, in fact, here's another thing. They actually, and I'm not a doctor, so don't get all keyed up here, but it's kind of interesting that simply is that the child is within the mother, and the child isn't actually, quote unquote, drowned within the mother's water. And in actuality, the child never uses his lungs. Interesting, isn't it? Until it is on the outside of his mother's womb, you see. And that's why the doctor will hit the child in the back in order to get that child to start breathing, you see, into air instead of dealing with water in the past. The next section is called Turning Water into Blood. All this analysis may have seemed to take the theme far from its base in the Red Sea, but as this symbol represents the human body or its blood, and this constitutes the very basis of human life, and the body is inseparable linked with the soul. The Red Sea may be said to be the chief ingredient in all human problems, whether being physical, religious, philosophical, or psychological. If the human body is not an essential element in all man's problems, it would be so only under the conditions that Hindu religion seems so strongly to suggest to us mortals, that we may so spiritualize our consciousness that we may release the soul completely from the impetus of the flesh. We need to be reminded here of St. Paul pointing assertion of the connection of our souls the same to the body, when he says, quote, "For God, who has caused the light to shine out of the darkness, hath shined in our own hearts. But we have this treasure in earthen vessel," end quote. This can be taken also in close connection with the statement of Greek philosophy. Quote, "I am a child of earth and the starry skies, but my race is of heaven alone," end quote. Yes, heaven is our true, original, and basic home. But the Father sends us for plurality from, that is, quote, "that imperial palace whence we came," end quote. Since it is the function of spirit or soul to impregnate matter with the dynamic of the divine mind, so that all life, all the universe may reflect the thought of the creative brain. So here's the key here, folks, and this is why, again, the whole issue of the head, the mind, everything of that nature is the superior part of your body, is by far. And that's why you should be pursuing knowledge. That's why you will gain wisdom. You don't get it in the lower parts of your body, folks. You never will. It was never made for that purpose. That was the purpose of simply procreating. But when you're talking about being someone who's impregnated with the matter, with the divine mind, that is a different, completely different, higher essence of everything. You see. The Judeo-Christian scriptures, that is, the, quote, Bible, do not contain material elaborations or the semantic potency or potential of the Red Sea symbolism comparable to what we find in the Egyptian and doubtlessly other, that is, literature. Yet there are touches which are decidedly significant, which when we take into connection with these or those found, especially in the great book of the dead, go far to corroborate the thesis herein developed. The most direct and surely a most cogent affirmation that the human body blood is seawater. That's right, seawater. That's SEA. In fact, a most astounding confirmation of it is found in the Revelations 8:8. Here indeed is a positive statement to the fact that the divine fire of soul went down into the sea, quote, "which is on the border of the earth," end quote, and did two things to it that should have meant for more to our slumbering cognitive faculties than they have appeared to do. First, it set the sea on fire, and second, it turned the sea into blood. Perhaps one of the most direct allegorical references to the expulsion of the sons of God from heaven and their incarnation on earth is found in the 8th chapter, 5th verse of Revelations. Quote, "And the angel took the censer, CENSER, and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth," end quote. This was the sending of fire from the empyrean, that is pi, P-Y-R, means fire in Greek, down to earth in the form of the hosts of angelic beings that were born of the mind of God, thus immaculately conceived, end quote. That is generated purely by spirit or mind energy in its, quote, uncontaminated, end quote, with gross matter. This is matched in the Old Testament by the first imagination of Abram, that is power, the first light out of Ur, the, quote, city, end quote, of the Chasm, and his goings, quote, west and south, end quote, into earthly incarnation, or, quote, Egypt, end quote. Both Ra and Ur means fire, end quote. The first Egyptian spelling and the second Babylonian Ur is the original Chaldean word for fire, becoming pure, P-U-R, a pi, P-Y-R, later in the Egyptian words. Pure is the Greek word for fire, still. These heaven-conceived, mind-born sons of God were called in Hindu systems the Agswata Pitras, fathers of the fire imagination, as Agan is fire in Sanskrit. They have become immemorially poeticized as the, quote, divine flames, end quote, the divine sparks, end quote. Man's soul is a spark of ray of the divine creative fire of mind, as all profound religions declare. Quote, I came from the sea of flames, exclaimed the soul in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Quote, from the lake of flame and the sea of fire, and I live, end quote. Speaking in Egyptian drama, the soul declares, quote, I am the great one, son of the great one, I am fire, son of fire, to whom was given his head who was cut off, end quote. The symbolism has represented the idea that even as Plato depicted it, the soul, as it were, loses its head, its higher dimension of consciousness when it descends into incarnation, and has to recover it by evolution here. And that's why sometimes me and Philip talked about basically people don't really actually grow up until they're basically 40 years old. Although in reality, sometimes we get the picture simply as it was supposed to happen at 30 years old, based upon the example of Jesus. So is paradise lost and paradise regained? We have all the legends of fire flaming forth out of the mouth or the nostrils of God, consuming his enemies. This is often polarized, I should say, as the, quote, wrath of God, end quote, devasting all things. In Deuteronomy, that is 32, we find the deity telling of the awful power of his mind energy. Quote, my wrath has flared up, flaming to the netherworld itself, burning up the earth and all it bears, setting the roots of the hills ablaze, end quote. And again, quote, from Sinai came the eternal blazing and fire from the south, end quote. We remember how his presence on Mount Sinai was accompanied by lightning, smoke, and flame. Well, those are examples of fire, isn't it? The fire element, the element of fire, lightning, smoke, and flame. The 7 golden candles in Revelation typify the 7 rays of divine imagination as it poured forth to create a 7-branched tree of life. The Old English ritual of burning the Yule log on the hearth was to symbolize the lighting up and final transfiguration of the natural body and nature of man by transforming power of the divine flame of spirit. The ropes binding Samson's arm when, quote, the spirit of the eternal inspired him nightly became like wax that has caught fire. The bonds melted off his hands, end quote. The Egyptians called the watery body of man, quote, the pool of the double fire, end quote. The dark, murky, smoky, smuggling fires of low sensations and the pure, clear, beautiful flame of compassion and love. The lower flames of the animal passions it need hardly be pointed out, were the fires of hell. Happily no one need fear the prospect of being tortured in the fires of a post-mortem Hades, as we are living in all the, quote, hell, end quote, we will ever experience right here on earth. And I've said that many times here recently. This planet is hell. It is. Look around you and see what's going on, folks. Even today, people suffer everywhere. Very few people actually don't suffer, folks. Even with those who have all the money in the world, eventually they will die, and they will suffer in some ways also. That fire in our blood is all the hell we will ever have to dread, though. But we had better dread it now. All we need to do is transmute these fires that burn in the blood with smudge, soot, and smoke into the pure flames of a beauteous light. That is, quote, for wickedness burneth as a fire. It shall devour the briars and the thorns, and shall kindle in the thickets of the forest, end quote. These are the coarse underbrush of the hatreds, greeds, and evil motives of our lives. And if reason and discipline will not burn them out, pain eventually will. Says the Greek philosopher, that is Hercules, quote, man is a portion of cosmic fire imprisoned in a body of earth and water. Interesting. John the Baptist said, whereas he will give us the lower baptism of, quote, that is the earth and water, the Christ coming after him will baptize us with the, what was that? End quote here, quote, with the holy air, that is the Spirit, or spiritus. Latin means, quote, air, and with fire, end quote. Jesus said, quote, I come to scatter fire upon the earth, end quote. Also, I behold Satan like lightning fall from heaven, end quote. All these are reference to the angelical hosts, you see, God's own sons, whom the Father dispatched to earth to do his work with his earthly children. He, quote, he hath made his angels messengers and his ministers a flame of fire, end quote. Spirit was universally symbolized by the element of fire, as was mind by air. What is the highest part on your body? It is your head, folks, your mind. Emotion by water and sensation by earth. Our souls are sparks of the divine flame. The fiery nature of spirit is indicated in the symbolism by the figure of incense and the censer, the latter being the miniature, quote, stove in which the heavenly fire burned and gave off its pleasing incense for God's delectation. The censer as a vessel which could contain and transport the fire of soul to earth must refer to what St. Paul calls our spiritual body. Within man's outer physical body, all religions of the archaic wisdom asserted that he had several finer bodies of cylindrical essence, still in a sense material, but not of the gross physical matter familiar to our senses. Science now knows the existence of matter in many ethereal spiritual forms, impalpable and invisible, yet quite literally real. And these inner bodies hold or convey the central nucleus of soul when the outer physical body is thrown off, are not yet assumed. The intimidation of the text of Revelation then is that the, quote, angel, end quote, the power of God, having packed the soul in a finer spiritual body, whisks it off to the altar and transports it down to earth. Then 2 verses later on that 8th chapter of Revelation, the text says that the 7 angels, that is, remember those 7 here, there's plenty of those numbers there, 7 angels, 7 churches, 7 trumpets, and there are other ones also. It is always projected forth from the heart, that is the altar of God's fire in 7 impulsions. Quote, prepared themselves to sound, end quote. And quote, and the first angel sounded, and there followed hail, H-A-I-L, and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, end quote. Here's the first mention of the divine fire connection with blood. But once these sparks or units of the fiery mind essence were installed in the bodies of animal creatures here on earth, they became, in a very real sense, the fiery power of the body blood. The generators of the electrical dynamism found in the blood. Quote, for in the blood is the life of the soul, end quote, says the scripture. Drain out a person's blood and the spark and fire, the dynamo of his life is gone. The fire has gone out on his heart. But then is the next. The 8th verse comes the crowning statement of the truth we are enunciating. And, quote, and the second angel sounded, as it were a great mountain burning with fire, was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood, end quote. The 2nd century Christian protagonist, that is Justin Mars, says that at the baptism of Jesus by John, quote, a fire was kindled in the waters of the Jordan, end quote. The actuality of the meaning hinted at by such poetic figures can be caught in quite realism from when one says of some outrage, that is, quote, it makes one's blood boil with indignation, end quote. Through the avenue of beautiful conceptual and imagery, we can come to the realization of what ancient poets meant when they speak of a fire blazing within the sea, and as fire always does to water, converting it into steam or vapor, and so enabling it to rise into the air. The 10th verse rounds out this phase of the incarnation symbolism by saying, quote, and the 3rd angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the 3rd part of the rivers and upon the fountations of the water, end quote. The 5th angel Blast also Blast also brought a falling star to earth. This is the lightning streak of Satan falling to earth, which Jesus says he beheld. So the divine fire of soul migrating to earth, says the great allegory in Revelation, set the sea on fire, made it glow all red and turned into blood. Will the fundamental literalist who insists that every word of the scripture is to be taken in its ball physical sense protest to us that the Pacific Ocean is blood? A thing of this sort is quite happily available to reduce the claims of literalism to their proper category of ribald nonsense. But because such a construction of poetic fancy collapses into preposterous fode-rol, when it literally actuality is insisted upon, let no one think that it is therefore is to be discarded and put out of court as irrelevant and valueless. Its dynamic value only emerges when it is claimed actual factuality is dropped and a truth structure is revealed to discerning vision deep within the frame of the outer allegory. Such was the form and method by which the ancient wise men defeated truth, by symbol and allegory. Hence, truly enough, not in the seven seas of our globe, but on the very heart of the life of mortal men, the heavenly fire conveyed to earth by God's own sons does dip down into the sea, which is the watery essence of those mortal bodies of ours, and does set them aflame with a fire of life and soul, and does turn them into blood. Who has not read over and over those mysterious verses of Revelations, flaring allegorism, and wonder what these words really meant? Here, at any rate, is one luminous key that can turn on the light of intelligent, rational meaning. But it is when we turn to old Egypt prodigious tomes of horrid wisdom that we see the symbolism more openly and clearly at work. In commenting on chapter 176 of the Book of the Dead, Budge, the noted Egyptologist, writes, quote, as fire and boiling water insisted in the underworld, that is our earth, this is where people get confused. They don't understand the underworld is earth, you see. He, that is the soul, hastens to protect himself from burns and scalds by reciting these chapters. Quote, for the title of these several chapters are, quote, of drinking water and not being burned by fire in the underworld, Sorry, I said underworld, world, end quote. And, quote, of not being scaled with water, end quote, showing how closely Old Testament material must have related to its antecedent Egyptian sources. We find this symbolism very closely matched in Isaiah 43. Quote, when thou passest through the waters, I shall be with thee, and through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned, neither shall the flame kindle on thee. End quote. The imagery here drawn straight from nature, from chemistry and physics, tells us in the fact that when the celestial fire of God, mighty spirit, is by incarnation introduced into the natural watery elements of the body, this fire is going to heat up this water, cause it to boil, and see it, so that we see a man in passion burning with hot zeal over some injury or affront. A burning within the sea. Sure enough, the ocean on fire, the bush all aflame, yet was not consumed. Remember the fiery bush? The bush was on fire and never consumed. If the soul, the God himself, who himself contributed the fire that heated the body, blood, was not sufficiently in control, he stood a fair chance of being, quote, scaled or scarred, end quote, by his own fiery rage. So the allegories represents the God's soul as being able to allay the storms of the sea of life, and fittingly enough represents the tempest as raging when he, the power within the ship, lies fast asleep down in the, quote, hold, H-O-L-D, end quote. So the manes, M-A-N-E-S, or shade, end quote, of the person in this underworld prays in the Egyptian ritual that he, quote, may have power over the water and not be drowned, end quote. Emerging from his dangerous journey across the sea in victory, he chants, quote, I am the being who is never overwhelmed in the waters. Sargon of Assyria, who was picked up out of the wicker basket floating in the reeds, that is the Reed Sea, by the river brink by the king's daughter, long before the same legend was repeated with Moses, exclaims. You wonder where that story comes from, you see. Quote, my mother gave me to the river, which drowned me not, end quote. Moses, that is, means drawn out of the water, end quote. The scriptures were found, see, they give you indications of what they're talking about here. The scriptures were found to give authoritative support to the symbolism of the sea being turned into blood, but it seemed unlikely that they would be found. Stated directly that this change came about as a result of the transfer of the stream of the Earth's biological evolution of life forms from the ocean to the land. Yet even a direct statement of that effect was encountered in the course of recent searching for the data supporting the these of this essay. Modern biological science and ancient fanciful Semitism find themselves in amazing accord in some verses in the early chapters of the book of Exodus. The fact of the chance coming from the shifting of the evolution chain from sea to land finds absolutely astonishing literal confirmation. That is in Exodus chapter 4, verses 9. The ancient allegorists, or perhaps it was the translator, substitute the word river, R-I-V-E-R, quote, for, quote, sea, S-E-A, end quote. But that is no way alters the sense. That is S-E-N-S-E. It is still the earth's great water body that is referring to speaking to Moses for the children of Israel. The Lord directs him to, quote, take up the water of the river and pour it upon the dry land. And the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the dry land, end quote. The idea is hinted at again in Exodus chapter 7, verses 17. The Lord speaking, quote, I will smite with the rod, or smite with the rod, that is in my hand upon the waters which are in the river, and they shall be turned to blood, end quote. Again in verse 19, the Lord commands Aaron to stretch out his rod and his hand over the waters of, quote, Egypt, end quote, that they may be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, end quote. Most highly ranking scholars regard this, quote, Egypt, end quote, of the Exodus narrative as a glyph for the earth and the human body, being the nadir point to which souls descend for incarnation, and also as a fey, quote, underworld, end quote, of mythology, as it is obvious that the Pacific Ocean has not turned to blood anywhere else than in the human bodies of Earth's people. One must realize that the piercing vision of the seer of old had hidden a salient truth of biological evolution beneath the allegory. If our Bible is found to be talking about this kind of truth, we had better read it a bit more closely and with an eye alert to pierce semantic veils for the discovery of more cryptic references. Then there is, quote, in verse 21, the statement that catalytic power of the, quote, rod, end quote, of spiritual fire so changed the water of the river that the Egyptians could no longer drink of it because it, quote, stank, end quote, which it obviously enough reference to an potable brashness taste. So then, quote, the Egyptians dig round about the river for water to drink, end quote. If a spiritual interpretation of this last symbolism is sought, it may be perhaps found in the idea that as the seawater stands for the basic natural life of man, this life of sense, animals and lower apatenians will, in the course of time and evolution, become repugnant to the soul, and it seeks refreshment from the pure aspirations of the spirit. Could anything in the sacred writings, that is, be more significant and illuminating than the announcement that man undergoes two baptisms, as it were two births, first that of water and then that of fire? Bracket stating here, ancient insight always assigns two mothers to the Christ figures, end quote, as water not only typifies, but virtually is the body. The first baptism depicts the experience the soul undergoes when its divine fire spirit is submerged in the waters of the lower nun. That is, incarnated in earthly water body. This phase is the incarnation ordeal, involves all the forms of experience that can accrue to man through the intermixture of the two sides, the segments of his dual being. that is his body and his soul, and can only be symbolized accurately by all the phenomena that are generated when fire meets and combats water. For a long time, the, quote, watery, end quote, elements of consciousness, sense, and emotion, that is earth and water. Here's the part of the sense being earth and emotion being water. Yeah, I guess. Predominantly and ruled the individual life. But gradually, and all too slowly, the pure and more powerful flames of reason and love gained ascension, or ascendancy, I should say. Inevitably, in the end, the more powerful element must win out. And this at once introduced the great symbolism of fire, drying up the water. And here we have the ground of all those allegories of the God power, drying up the waters of a sea or river in order that the sons of God, that is in brackets in the Old Testament, that is the Israelites, who incidentally are not the Hebrews as a nation or race, but purely a spiritual grouping. I'll say that again, folks. That the sons, capital S, of God in the Old Testament, the Israelites, who incidentally are not the Hebrews as a nation or race, but purely a spiritual grouping, may cross over without being drowned. So what this means simply is that these people were not what we hear about today. When the, quote, sea, end quote, starts to burn, it will in the end be dried up. And with this comes one of the most startling revelations, esoteric significance in all the realms of symbolic depreciation of truth. The truth as to the conversion of sinful man into a man sinless and divine. For as the, quote, sinning, end quote, nature of the first unredeemed Adam is symbolized by water, and water by nature falls. The action upon it by the application to it of the fiery power of the divine soul, which will vaporize it, converts it into a state analogous to steam, a form of which it too, like fire, shall rise again. What mortal lesson could be more potent, I should say, than the realization that if man lives in the realm of base passion, he will continue to fall. Do you understand, folks? Very clear here. His passions will destroy him. He will never move up. Because they're emotions. Emotions are not at the top. So your feelings today doesn't, you have a bad day or whatever, a feeling such and such. It's not cognitive of who you really are. He will continue to fall, but that if he will purge his carnal sensualities of their gross selfish character, he will rise. So St. Paul states endlessly on the theme that the indulgence of the interests of the flesh means death, whereas the cultivation of the interests of the spirit means life and peace. He's speaking simply here, not in a physical deal somewhat, although he is in some ways also, but many people today are caught up in the flesh, you see, because they're not cultivating the spirit. They're not cultivating the higher essence of man. That is basically the fire and air sign, so to speak. He's not moving upward. To descend into and remain bound under the watery, end quote, nature of the body and its sensual instincts is, in the great theology of the Greeks, a virtual death to, quote, dry out, end quote, these heavy, sluggish motivations by the superior power of the rational soul is to achieve the resurrection. The scriptures speak figuratively of the power of God as rebuking the sea and smiting the sea, end quote, confounding the sea, that is. This defeats the spirit power to check, change, and ultimately destroy the force of the lower motivations of the, quote, flesh, end quote. The, quote, old man of the sea, end quote. Doubtless, this is the origin of the poetic phase, that is, quote, to suffer a sea change, end quote. Translated in terms of modern psychology, this type of would have relevance to the function of super consciousness power of the great, end quote, quote, I should say, unconscious, end quote, in man to check, control, and redirect the energies of the conscious part of his psychism. When the interpreters of the scripture can show that the meaning so cryptically disguised under glyph and symbol has immediately pertinence to the psyche, and the spiritual life of all mortals, the great legacy of ancient Holy Writ will be able to reassert its benign influence. Etius, the great fish, as all parts and elements of the natural world were instinct with symbolic intimations for the discerning mind of ancient Semitism, that which the sea so voluminous generates is living product, that is the fish, could not escape the search for meaningful significance. How prolifically we have the great symbol utilized in the archaic representation. Mythology teems with the recurrence of the whales, the dolphins that transport the heroes across the waters, the sea serpents that attempt to strangle infant deities, monsters of the deep and plain common fish that serve as food, or one that turns up with a gold coin in its mouth. The intimations of symbolic meaning of the fish typology are among the profoundest in the realm of ancient Semitism. A few of these must be examined. Striking indeed it is that we find the fish to be the monographic symbol of the Christ himself in the initial stage of the inception of Christianity. There was much reason for the church leaders such as Augustine and Tertullian to speak of Jesus as the great fish in the sea, and his followers, that is the Christians, as the little minnows, or in Greek symbolism, that is the Christ figure was typified as the great fish, or Pisces of the zodiac. And so that demonstrates right here, folks, that Pisces is speaking of the zodiac, which reflects that time period. This was inevitably when one knows of the additions of the inspired religious mind of the ancient day to the custom of making the zodiac serve as a graph of all esoteric significance. This in itself a vast, complex, and deeply recondile study, seemingly fathomlessly in the profundity and cogniency of its implications for understanding the religious life of man. Most simply defined, the zodiac is a figure depicting the journey of the sun through the cycle, and when I speak of sun, I'm talking about S-U-N, through the cycle of the 12 sections of the heavens, both on the period of its earthly annual revolution or to that of the full cycle of the processions of the equinox through the whole 12 houses of the sky. And he's got it here based upon 25,868 years, known as the Great Cycle. The smaller annual cycle was a miniature of the Great Processional Cycle and served equally well for typology. In the spirit of the symbology, it was the custom of the ancient sages of the divine wisdom to typify and designate the power of the coming Christos under the name and nature of the sign of the zodiac, in which the sun stood for approximately 2,160 years of its status in each house. For instance, in the sign of Leo, the Christ power was in the region dominated by Jewish religionism, that is the line of Judah. Under the Cancer sign, the Egyptians dubbed it the sacred scarab or beetle. Cancer having been the sign of the beetle before it was that of the crab. When the sun in Gemini, that is the twins, the divine nature was the dual force of good and evil, the twin brothers, symbolized by the stars Castor and Pollux in the sky, Pollux. In Taurus, the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and even the Israelites worshiped the divine power under the symbol of the sacred bull. You remember that? The golden calf, the cow of Isis and other goddess. Remember that? In Aries, the ram, the great symbol of the Son of God, was, of course, the sacrificial lamb, and in Greek mythology, the golden fleece. And when Christianity was taking form, the sun was making the transit from Aries into Pisces, the sign of the two fishes. Hence, the ram and lamb symbolized still prevail, but the Pisces figuratism was being introduced, and its presence in the Christian literature and even in the religious early iconographic is surprising in evidence. The astute-minded Greeks, that is, dealing with the Christos concept in this intriguing fashion, therefore portrayed the divine avatar for the Piscean age as the great fish. And a myth like the Jonah whale fabrication was inedible. The ancient Sumerians ancestors of the Babylonians, have spoken of the fish incarnation of Vishnu. And the ancient eponymous heroes of the Chaldeans was Lonis, the fish avatar under the name of Dagon. Remember that god also? And Dag is the Hebrew word for fish. But the Greeks ingeniously took their word for fish, which is Iticus, and using each letter of the word as the initial of a word, coined the sentence phrase, quote, Iticus Christos Theos Iudius Sodia, which reads, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. It is known at the Iticus monograph of Christ, that is the fish, that is the, quote, fish avatar, end quote, of the Greeks. Such was the general vogue of this fish image of divinity that using a Latinized form of the word, the Greeks in its early years of Christian movement habitually referred to the Christians as the Piscean, that is Latin meaning fish, or Pisces, the little fish, you see, end quote. It was just a popular exploitation of the figurative flourish of the zodiac symbol with a touch perhaps of slight derision. It could be that of this appellation was flavored with a bit of scrutiny of mind contempt, as the Christians were universally regarded in the inception of their fanatic upsurge of ignorant pietism and pitiably deluded religious zealots. In fact, the very name Christians was first fastened on them at Antioch. The book of Acts states as a term properly ridiculing people who were so unintelligent as to believe that the Christos, yes, even the Logos, the unthinkable power that created the galaxies of the cosmos, was walking around down here on earth and ensconced in the body of a man said to have been a carpenter in Galilee. That's right, folks. There are people who still believe this stuff, literally. And I was once that way, too. You have to move up, folks. You have to see things as they, not as they are, but as illustrations for deeper things. They claimed that this obscure and obvious deluded countryside preacher and prophetess of the swift coming of the kingdom of God, in which he was to sit in glory perpetually on the right hand of the eternal God, was the, quote, fish avatar, or the absolute deity. To philosophical Greeks, this idea that the infinite power predicated in their great concepts represented by the cosmic trinity would be compressed in the body of a man of our human order was incredibly crude, naive, and preposterous, and the cultural Greeks, as also the Romans, held them in supreme contempt as pitiable, ignorant pietists, as we think of certain sects in our civilization today who continue to predict the immediately coming of the Christ and the, quote, end of the world, end quote. Yes, that is being taught right now at this time period. It was taught in the 70s. You know, I've lived here a little over 60 years, and I heard these things talking about in the early 70s, in the 80s. You know, it's been continuous to that thing that Jesus is coming. Well, Jesus never came the first time, folks. That might be a shock to many of you that believe that, but it was a spiritualized. It was never a human Jesus, so to speak. We'll continue on. But perhaps the most telltale evidence of the astrological symbolism connected with Christianity is to point to the significant fact that the Galilean Messiah, that is, he had 12 disciples, were declared to be, quote, fishermen, end quote. Christian theological lucubration has never once had the candor to face the devastating challenge which this obvious link with zodiacal symbolism presents to the claimed historicity of the Gospels. If there was a historical, actually 12 men attached to Judea, claimant for the mantle of messiahship, they would have, quote, inherited, end quote, the designation of, quote, fishermen, end quote, no matter if they were farmers, herdsmen, tradesmen, or as Matthew was, a tax collector, a publican, simply by virtue of the Semitic spirit of the religious traditions of the age. For the Sabaean constructions of Chaldean astrology, I should say, projected in occult circles almost as pictorial Bible, were universally rife among the mysteries groups, such as the Gnostics, the Manichaeans, the Essenes, and other associations of mystical occult bent. On the Aries, that is, symbolism, they would have been, quote, shepherds, and under Tarian, would be cow herds. Under Capricorn, it would be goat herdsmen, end quote. Then the Christians themselves adopted the two fishes of the Piscean sign as their own emerald. That is, in the catacombs of Rome, the dual fish monogram was everywhere in evidence, carved or pictured in many ways, even on the forehead of their images of the Christ, and on the walls and altars. And Jesus instructed Peter to find the gold coin wherewith to pay the tax levy in the fish mouth. And he said, quote, I will make you fishers of men, end quote. And his last wonder work was the miraculous draught of fishes that broke the net. The fish bladder. In Latin, the Vestis Pisces was utilized as a symbol of the presence of mind. There goes that air sign in the body, which is a water sign. Fish also was a symbol of the presence of air in the water, imitating the presence of mind, air in the body, water. Fish also was a symbol of divine food for man, since his soul, once it was immersed in the, quote, sea, end quote, of incarnation, would find fish his most natural food. The great religious ritual of Egypt, that is the Book of the Dead, traumatized the god as declaring, quote, I am the great and mighty fish, which was in the city of Qem-ur, end quote. And a statement is that he shall in the end be freed from the great Abtul fish, meaning that he, like Jonah, released from the whale after 3 days, would be liberated from the necessity of further incarnations. Likewise, the Egyptians pictured, that is, the goddess Neith, Neith, quote, not quote, but in brackets, whose name geromancy equates with net, N-E-T, brackets close, as fishing Horus, the Christ, out of the sea as the Pharaoh's daughter fishes Moses out of the waters among the reeds. See how to connect here. Beautiful way of saying here. At least two of the prominent goddesses of the Eastern Mediterranean region, Argadius and Semiramis, were called, quote, what? Fish mothers, end quote. And on the head of Nile, a earlier form of the goddess Hathor, there was inscribed a perch. Neith carried the shuttle or knitter for the weaving of his fish nets. The emblem, of the goddess catching the Son of God as a fish in her net would dramatize the simple fact of incarnation. To begin with, as the feminine is matter, that is, its symbol is water, naturally. And matter catches the incarnating souls in its meshes. But as the ordeal of life in the sea of matter eventually lifts the captured souls of this realm of incarnated life into the world of spirit. And what is spirit? It is air. Even so, also the act of fishing in the release of souls from the captivity in the body. That is the, quote, Red Sea, end quote. The fish floating above in the water is the most forceful symbol of organic life immersed in inorganic matter. And that is precisely what the fish symbol most commonly portrayed. A fish in the sea almost shouts at us the fact of our being divine souls, the product of organic evolution, emerged and floating above in the sea of inorganic atomic matter, a phase from an archaic formulaire, expressing concisely the basic idea of souls incarnated in matter, referring to them as, quote, suffering under the dense sea, end quote, of matter. Perhaps the future stability of the edifice of the Christian religion may be severely shaken from the startling revelation that the Greek word for, quote, sea is pontos, P-O-N-T-O-S, and for, quote, dense, D-E-N-S-E, is piletos, P-I-L-E-T-O-S, which would take the form of Latin and Pontius Pilate, end quote. We can only ask, can this etymology be the origins of the creed's phrase, that is, quote, he suffered under Pontius Pilate, end quote? But another line of research leads us to further amazing disclosure in this, quote, fishing expedition, end quote. It has been shown earlier that the ancient original Egyptian short name of the primordial, undifferential sea of being, so to say, our, quote, empty space, end quote, was Nun, N-U. Its masculine, quote, spiritual manifestation was non, N-U-N. And its feminine, that is the material, polar opposite was nut, N-U-T. It has just been said that the primary symbolism of the fish floating in the sea was the image of units of divine spirit souls, that is always masculine, and merged in the water of incarnation. The term nun, N-U-N, then would be sheer embolism, representing spirit in matter, and as man's level and station in evolution, the soul in the body. The cosmic nun being the great father spirit, we surprisingly find that in Chaldean and Semitic, nun, N-U-N, means the great fish, symbolized in the heavens as the constellation of Cetus, the whale, the sons of God, his little, quote, fish, end quote, children, would be the offspring of the great fish, or sons of Nun. Following this guided thread, we run into such an amazing correlation of ideas and symbols as fairly to stagger our minds with the marvel of it all. First of all, and almost immediately knock out for us, we find that the all ancient astrology, astrology, I'll get it right one day, formulation represents the Christ characters being born in the house of sign of Pisces. All were sons of the, quote, fish mothers, end quote. This was inevitable from the fact of Semitic science that the first or natural man is our dual nature. That is, being the son of the Virgin had to be represented as being born in Virgo. But the spiritual man, his direct polar opposite, would then have to be born exactly across the zodiac from Virgo, and that brought the second of spiritual birth in Pisces 6 months later. And in the first chapter of Luke's Gospel, Jesus the Christ is declared to have been born just 6 months after his natural man forerunner, that is John the Baptist. And all symbolism has been shown above. What then? On top of that is an astonishment when we find that there was another Jesus way back there in the Old Testament. Yes, a man with the Jesus name, one of the dozens or more variant spellings of his name, that is Jesus, but still Jesus. Namely, that his name was Joshua. And whose son was he? That is Joshua, son of Nun, N-U-N. Here was Jesus by name, and this time connected with the descent from the fatherhood represented by the great fish. Still further heightened, the wonder comes to the next datum in the Hebrew alphabet. Every letter has a corollary designation, that is a nickname, end quote, so to say, which gives some recognizable intimidation of its function in the canon of sounds and signs which make up the alphabet. Aleph, that is mean A, means, for instance, ox. Beth, B, means house. Gimel, that is G, means Campbell. Daleh means D, means door, etc. When we come to the middle of the alphabet, which point represents the lowest level of matter into which the fire of soul descends before it turns to return back to the heaven of spirit, and is therefore the place of water, matter's eternal symbol, we find that M is the Hebrew hieroglyph for waves of water, as N is in the Egyptian, and its alphabetical name is Mem, and means water. And that N, that is, brace yourself for a jolt, has for its nickname fish. And of all things wonderful is called Nun, that is N-U-N. M is Mem. N is Nun. It is well to see that we have together here Joshua, or / Jesus, born in Pisces, even in Christianity, and son of Nun, the fish, Jesus, son of Nun. Virgo was called the, quote, house of bread, end quote. That divine bread that Jesus said came down from heaven and was made man, as Christ to God and man. Pisces was the house of the great fish, or the dual fishes, you see. Bread and fish were therefore made to symbolic dual food for man. The one physical and the other is spiritual nourishment. None of us would see that, folks, did we? Did we see that? Bread representing the physical, the outer body, the fish representing the spiritual. Most wonderfully, in old Egypt Semitic science, the cities were often named from some function of the deified life, that is, deified life. A city in which it was symbolically said that Horus, that is, the Christ, was born and died, was Anu, which became A and Y. When transferred to English, the Greek U always turning to English, why? A very significant item mentioned is that the quote, the place of multiplying the divine bread, end quote. The birth of the Christ soul in all men surely multiplies that heavenly bread broken for all souls at the Eucharist. So, through the association with Virgo and its symbolic name, that is the house of bread, that's what Bethlehem also is about, the house. The opposite house of Pisces, house of the fish, merges its emblematism with its polar opposite, and the two symbols, bread and fish, become the twin forms of man's divine food. Should we be then too stunningly struck with amazement when we find that our New Testament Gospels themselves contain the allegory of the Christ character feeding a multitude of people in hunger after 3 days by miraculous multiplying bread and its companion symbol fish? And where did this multiplication of the divine food take place in the Gospel? Yes, at this same town that is in it, A-N-U, to which the Hebrews had such date fixed their words for house. Beth. Beth means Bethlehem, means house. Simply to give its astronomical, I didn't mean to say Bethlehem, Simply to give its astrological reference to the zodiac house of bread, and thus it became, quote, Bethany. Bethany. So both in ancient Egypt and in the Hebrew Christian scriptures, the Christ figure dramatized the miracle of feeding the multitudes of mortals in the symbolic city of Nu by multiplying the divine bread and fish. Are we ready? There for the next flash of realization of great discovery, which starts out from the philological imitations of his name, the, quote, house of bread, end quote. It flashes upon us when we simply ask how one says, quote, house of bread in Hebrew, ordinary Hebrew, for the answer to that is none other than the astonishing word of Beth, meaning house, and Lahem, meaning bread. House of bread. Bethlehem. Bethlehem is Bethany, house of combined bread and fish for the Christ, as Jesus says positively is the product of two births, the one natural of water, the other spiritual of spirit, being fire, of bread, Virgo, and fishes, being Pisces. Quote, you must be born again, end quote. He said, born of water and the spirit fire. Virgo is the first great mother of life. Formless and code matter. The virgin motherhood, and her name was almost everywhere a form of the name for sea or water. Pisces in the zodiac represents the second mother of life, organic matter that has been impregnated by the rays of the divine sun, S-U-N, of life or divine spirit. Virgo can give birth only to natural man. Pisces gives birth to the spirit soul, which matter and organic could not do. Pisces is the fish, the symbol of organic life born out of the sea, so that its Christly offspring, the Christs themselves, are all fished up out of the sea. And in brackets it says, recall that a legend said that the Messiah was to come up out of the sea, in bracket. And one facet of an ancient symbolism of life was said to have emanated from the fish's mouth. In an uranograph or chart of the heavens, the stream of life was pictured as flowing forth from the constellations in the southern sky, called the southern fish, or to correspond to that of the Cetus, the whale, in the northern sky. Thence it flowed north and emptied its stream just under the foot of the constellation of Orion. The great cluster of bright stars seen in our sky of winter was an ancient astrological portrayal that represented of the Christ. Orion was the mighty hunter, followed by his dog, the great dog star Sirius, by which was meant that the power of the divine mind, seeking to stamp the shape of his creative ideas upon all matter, led the way of evolution, while behind is trailed the animal, the faithful dog, that is, the body. Mythology had it that Orion was pressing on in pursuit of the Pleiades. That is the cluster of 6 stars some little distance ahead of him, called the Seven Sisters, but with 1 star missing. The subtle intimation here can be only that spirit must seek to express itself through the agency of the natural world, natural being, feminine always, and also eternally structuralized upon the basis of the creative or creational number 7. That one is yet missing, is likely to imitate that since all the cycles of evolving life manifest 6 formations of physical substance or planes of existence for the expression of their creative forces. The spiritual mind power, which the structuralization of cosmic energy is destined to express, not being physical, but spiritual, is not manifest in physical form with its 6-fold basis. Let us remember that creation covers 6 days, you see, and not 7. You see God resting on that cosmic Sabbath from his labors. The physical universe is always the visible side, you see. The cosmic mind power that each cycle demonstrates by the work is produced at 6 levels is invisible. As imagery of this sort seems overly subtle and is a bit thin in spots, it must be realized that the religious mind of the ancient day disported itself, so to say, and solace a fancy of this kind. And if one will follow them closely, they will be found to adumbrate the soundest and unassailable truth. And the truths thus imitate are always deeper related to man's inner life and experience, are in fact the deepest truths that the human mind can grasp. Well then, if the fish is the symbol of organic life generated out of the inorganic, the ancient starry drama would represent the stream of organic life emanating from the substrate matter of the physical universe from the very womb of matter. Of the, let's see, where am I at here? Of the matter of the physical universe from the very womb of matter, as the sages like to phrase it often, when evolution has developed it to the supreme organic unity of function, and thence it proceeds up the path of growth and development. State of Godhead symbolized by Orion. In brief, it says that the stream of organic evolutions arising out of the sea reaches this high goal of Godhead in Orion. It is to be noted that the astrological depreciation does not give it as arising out of the water directly, but out of the southern fish itself, the product of a long evolution of organic structure arising out of the inorganic virgin matter. It is important to clarify this double-stage procedure of the drama of creation, for inorganic matter could not generate self-conscious mind in creatures starting at the bottom of the scale of manifest being. Inorganic matter was the, quote, old first mother, end quote, and could give birth only to organic matter, considered as her daughter. The daughter then, in turn, since she grew the instrumentality of her highly developed specialized functionalism, such as a brain and nerves, could give birth to mind, reason, and will, and love in her creatures, would thus be the second mother, and her child, the Christ. In zodiacal terms, the Virgo, that is, mother energy of matter, could not herself birth the Christ, but could produce her own daughter. Pisces, who represents the organic universe, could bear the Christ consciousness in the brains and hearts of her offspring. Virgo had first to bear Pisces, and Pisces in turn bore the Christ. All ancient sun gods and saviors were, quote, born, end quote, in the house of Pisces, the house of fish and bread, being Bethlehem. So that'll be our conclusion tonight, part 2. So we're going to end that right here. Thank you for being here. Wish you a good evening. You take care, and we'll talk soon. That is part 2. The Red Sea is Your Blood, part 2. That is by Alvin Boyd Kuhn. Wish you a good evening, and you take care.